Okay, welcome back, everyone. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Susan Schulten. In my kitchen at home, atop a pile of books that my family knows not to touch, is a dog-eared and highly annotated copy of her book, America in 100 Maps. Susan, your book gave me 3 months of lunchtime reads during this now 10-month pandemic, so thank you very much for that. And in the midst of all of our political craziness, I reached out to Susan to see if she knew anyone who might speak about gerrymandering, one of the subjects in her book. And she offered me a couple of names of modern experts, but then added, if I wanted to hear about the historical context of gerrymandering, she would be happy to, at that time, interrupt her ski vacation to present to our group. Well, here she is, unfortunately not fresh off the slopes because they don't have snow, but professor of history at the University of Denver, a graduate of Cal Berkeley with a PhD from UPenn, Susan Schulten. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Bay Area Map Group for having me. This is my first time visiting your meeting. And of course, in this age, one silver lining is that we all get to join everybody's meeting all the time. So, I really appreciate Tom's invitation. It's so wonderful to see so many friends on the call. Many of you have been so important to me, and I want to especially acknowledge that I am not an expert in gerrymandering, but there is someone on the call who is, and that person is Mark Monmonier, who has been a hero of mine for 25 years now, and who very kindly, when I was a graduate student, answered my letters before we had email, when I wrote to him and asked him for guidance about the kind of work I was interested in at the time around 20th century World War II maps. So I really want to acknowledge how much Mark has meant to me over the years. And many of you who have helped me through the trade and through universities, Ron Grimm, Eliane Dotson, Julie Sweetkin-Singer, sorry. And I do want to say to Susan Powell how wonderful that collection is. I can't wait to tell some of my seniors who are interested in mapping World War II about that resource. So thank you very much. I'm going to speak very briefly about some maps that show us the history of gerrymandering. I've been told to keep it brief. I know you've had a long morning. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and show you a few interesting maps.
Yeah, and Susan, just to, you've got a good 20 minutes, right, Mike?
20 minutes to cover 300 years, right?
Well,
no, I'm teasing. But here we go. Now, the moment that we're in today is even more fraught than when Tom called me several weeks ago. Many of you have lamented the political polarization that we're facing now. The only thing I can tell you is that this is endemic to representative democracy, but the polarization that we're experiencing right now is made even worse by the increasing sophistication of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering makes all races less competitive, and we have seen the rather horrifying upshot of that, where in some extreme situations, representatives can actually determine their voters as opposed to the reverse. I wanted to show you just a few historical examples that might give you a sense of the through lines of gerrymandering. We're in a new era now, especially as Mark Monmonier has argued with electronic mapping and algorithms. I'm going to show you the sort of analog history of all this. But despite the technological advances, we're still talking about essentially the same thing, which is the manipulation of lines for the purpose of ensuring homogeneity and victory. Any representative democracy depends upon districts. The only exception, of course, is the idea of at-large voting, which has not been the case in the United States for a very, very long time. Essentially was done away with in 1842. But if you're going to have representative districts, you have to draw the line somewhere. And that's where districting, redistricting manipulation comes in. Now, this goes back to the origin of the republic itself. Many of you who've been paying attention to politics have thought about the history of fraught transitions between parties, and the most fraught of those, or the earliest of those transitions between parties at the executive level was in 1800, when John Adams conceded after a very protracted tabulation period to Thomas Jefferson. Now, the reason that's important is it was a handoff not just between two men in the executive, but between two parties. Jefferson's subsequent 2 terms were highly partisan. This is the story of American political exchanges in the early 19th century. In fact, political parties are themselves the outgrowth of the divisions in politics in the 1790s. And so once Jefferson's term reaches an end, we're also looking at a census of 1810. Those 2 things coincide, and that's where I want to begin. The Federalists in Massachusetts had controlled politics throughout that state's history. They had deep disdain for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. And in 1811, the Jeffersonian Republicans managed to wrest control away from the Federalists and elect a Republican governor, Elbridge Gerry, Gerry. He became the governor of Massachusetts. Like I said, that victory of a Republican in Massachusetts coincided with the 1810 census, which allowed the Republicans who had won control of the state house itself to redraw the boundaries for subsequent elections. And they do that, and they manage to do very well in redrawing those boundaries. In the subsequent election, the Republicans managed to elect more representatives to the state house than the Federalists for the second time. And that drove them to double down on using any electoral edge they could. When they redraw those boundaries, the governor, Gerry, signs off on that. And that's really important. Elbridge Gerry signs off on those Republican-controlled districts. And the ones I want to show you and draw special attention to showed up in the Federalist newspaper, the Boston Gazette, which was controlled by Federalist Benjamin Russell, in March of 1812. And I apologize if your strip of little thumbnails is cutting it off, but the map I want you to pay attention to is here on the right, the one of Essex County, which drew a lot of scrutiny in the aftermath of that. The Federalists found Essex County particularly galling because it managed to connect the Republicans around the perimeter of Essex County and to concentrate the Federalists in the interior. And that gambit paid off. In the next election, with even fewer votes than the Federalists, the Republicans managed to elect more representatives. In other words, redistricting worked here. And in the next several weeks, the engraver and painter Elkanah Tisdale, designed an image that took advantage of the Essex County map and tried to satirize it in a comic sort of way. He reproduces it using 4 woodblocks that are actually in the Library of Congress. I don't know if Ron Grimm wants to say anything about that during the Q&A. And those eventually morphed into a political cartoon with claws and wings and a dragon head that I'll show you in just a minute. That is published in the Boston Gazette in a few weeks after this one was published in the Boston Gazette, in the same paper, and satirized the Republican techniques of redistricting. Now, as the story goes, there was a dinner party populated by Federalists, and someone looked at the map of Essex County and says, well, that's so strange. It looks like a salamander. And someone else says, no, it's even stranger than that. It's a gerrymander, satirizing not just the governor in terms of his politics on signing off on that, but also satirizing him in a different way that I'll show you in just a second. This is the image from the Salem Gazette, which reproduced the Boston Gazette map, the Tisdale map, courtesy of PJ Mode and Persuasive Maps at Cornell. And it's accompanied by a very exuberant and dramatic attack by the Federalists on the Republicans for their manipulation. And if you read it, you cannot but pay attention and notice how similar some of our rhetoric is today, which is the feeling that what gerrymandering does is to stifle the majority, in the words of the Federalists. I'm going to zoom in even further because there's some nice little details on this. But what it's essentially done is to take that Essex map and to highlight the Republican districts that were connected and contiguous, but in a highly strange way. And I've turned it 90 degrees here so you can see that it's not just, of course, a dragon, but if you look more closely, you can see here at left, it's satirized Jerry's profile. There's his hook nose, right? There's his chin. So it's permanently attached him to this thing. Redistricting becomes known in a shorthand way as gerrymandering. This poor man who was a deep patriot and lover of the country, who had sterling credentials in political realms, but was forever connected with this idea that the opposition, it's never one's own, right, party, it's always the opposition that is manipulating districts. Now, to fast forward here, I want to show you just a slightly different tack. This is what's called packing, right? That is to say, they're packing the opposition into the interior here to minimize its representative power. But there's a companion technique, which is known as cracking. Many of you know this. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, and especially after the collapse of Reconstruction, African Americans were subject to terrible methods of disfranchisement, some of them perfectly legal, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, constitutional tests, but some of them quite violent, right? The use of the Klan, the use of the White League, assassination, intimidation, those kinds of tactics. The goal was to minimize the Black male vote that had been guaranteed under the 15th Amendment. And essentially by the 1890s, that had worked in many, many ways. But I draw your attention here to a redistricting map from Alabama in 1894. And the reason it's interesting to me is that this is a moment in the 1890s when poor white and Black sharecroppers are beginning to align in very, very preliminary ways around populist candidates. In other words, white poor sharecroppers are not necessarily being loyal or consistently voting for the Democratic Party, which dominated the American South, but instead beginning to defect and vote for populists. Some African Americans had signaled their support for that as well. And so what the state legislature of Alabama does after the census of 1890 is to use its Democratic dominated power to draw those new district lines in order to take that African American population here along the Cotton Belt and to crack it. And you can see that each one of these districts takes a piece of that African American vote in order to dilute the African American vote and to prevent it from exerting its singular power, because a significant proportion of Alabama was African American. This is a legacy, of course, of slavery. So we've got packing in the first instance and cracking in the second instance. Now, the repression of the African American vote in the South is pretty complete by about 1900 or 1910. In other words, white Democrats simply don't have to worry about the African American vote because African American men and women in the aftermath of the 19th Amendment were completely disfranchised by a series of means. What you have is total dominance across the South, what we refer to when I was growing up as the solid South. That is challenged in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, which protects very specifically African American access to the ballot. And what you see in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act is a doubling down on gerrymandering as a way of diluting the power of the African American vote. One of the most extraordinary examples of that, and I couldn't find a good non-pixelated version of this, so I'll just describe it to you. But it's in the way it's the redistricting of the state capital of Mississippi, the city of Jackson, in 1973, as a way to get around the Voting Rights Act. The African American population of Jackson was diluted into 5 separate districts, diluted in order to connect them to white-dominated districts if you go north and west away from Jackson, right? So this was a successful technique and a perfectly legal way to get around the Voting Rights Act. When the Voting Rights Act comes up for renewal in 1982, Congress tries to address this. And they do so with a phrase that becomes incredibly consequential. And I'm paraphrasing here, But essentially, Congress says that minorities or protected classes have a right to elect representatives of their choice. This profoundly shapes electoral politics in subsequent years. Democrats begin to try to craft districts where minorities would constitute a majority. And that is part and parcel why we see some of the crazy gerrymandered districts that sometimes make the news. I'll give you one example of that. The most litigated state, I think, around gerrymandering is North Carolina. And what I'm showing you here is a series of maps that a geography student here at DU made for me for a history of America in 100 maps to try to capture what had happened to the 12th district in the state of North Carolina from 1993 to our own day. And so what she did very creatively was to sit with me and look at the different iterations of the 12th district in order to try to show readers, right, just how insane some of these districts are. At its craziest, you have it here at right, was the redistricting that happened in the early 1990s, what's sometimes referred to as the I-85 corridor map, a one that so creatively, you can see if you look very carefully that it is contiguous, but in some places it is no wider than the interstate itself. And the goal here is to connect Charlotte to Winston-Salem, to Greensboro, to Durham. And despite the craziness here, it had what some would consider a salubrious effect. For the first time in American history, the state of North Carolina elected an African-American to the House of Representatives. And so you have a kind of odd outcome of what had historically been a way to manipulate one's strength relative to the opposition. Chief Justice Sandra Day O'Connor looked at this, this first iteration of the 12th district, and she said it made her deeply, deeply uneasy because more than anything, it evoked the terrible era of Jim Crow. But she also recognized that in segregating African Americans, it was done in order to create a certain outcome that Congress itself had mandated with the amendment to the Voting Rights Act. And that is what creates a little bit of an irony here that sometimes we don't fully appreciate. In some ways, the current dilemma is that African Americans or other protected classes who benefit from some of these majority-minority districts that are gerrymandered are at odds with sometimes their own party. So in other words, this district here elected an African American representative, but it also weakened the Democratic Party elsewhere. And so you have a different, an odd and slightly ironic alliance here between, in this case, African Americans and Republicans, who are only too happy to relegate some of these districts to minorities in order to maximize Republican strength elsewhere. And that's what I'll focus on in the last little inset here. In 2010, the Republicans won both houses of the North Carolina legislature. And as many of you know, you've lived through this. This was a pattern that was replicated throughout the South, so that the solid South of our youth, dominated by the Democratic Party, has now reversed. Of course, Georgia and that outcome 2 weeks ago may signal a slight reversal again. But for much of the late 20th and early 21st century, you see the South moving toward the Republican Party. Now, when the Republicans win control of both houses of the legislature in North Carolina in 2010, they are given the right, of course, to redistrict as they so choose based on the census of 2010. And what they did was to pack, as you see here, Democratic votes into 3 districts, including District 12 that you're looking at. It managed to reinforce Republican strength and further weaken the Democratic Party across North Carolina by both packing and diluting. Now, the map on the left may not look that different to you from the map on the right, but small tweaks produce really, really important political advantage. Republicans won less than 49% of the state vote in this election, but they took 9 out of 13 seats in the House of Representatives. And that trend, like I said, was replicated across the South. As the Republican Party gained control of state legislatures in the South, so too could they use this to their advantage. Now, like I said at the beginning, we all know, you know better than I do, how consequential this is. It has, everybody bemoans gerrymandering, right? But we also have blind spots as to who's doing it when. One thing I want to leave you with, and I know very little about this, but my son is a budding mathematician in college now. He's crazy about the uses of data. And his hero is a woman named Moon Duchin, who some of you know runs a lab out of the mathematics department at Tufts University. The name of the group is the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group. And what they do, they have a pretty clear political agenda, and that is to advance access to the ballot. They consider themselves advocates for civil rights. And they're trying to use new frontiers in mathematics to get to a deeper and fairer system. I don't know how they do that because my math skills are very primitive. But what I want to leave you with is just the irony here that the map is absolutely at the heart of gerrymandering. If you are interested in maps, this is one of the areas where the maps are the beginning and the end. Gerrymandering, redistricting simply cannot take place without a map. So the map has been part and parcel of how gerrymandering has worked over the last 200 years. And at the same time, the map might be the pathway forward if we think about new solutions. I'm going to close there. I want to respect people's time, but please, I'm happy to take questions or to make Mark Monmonier take questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much. I'm sure there are questions, and if they're not, I'm going to jump in quickly.
Okay, I'd like to thank Susan for this, I think it was a very good historical review of gerrymandering. Obviously, I've been interested in some of the earliest maps showing the gerrymander in Massachusetts. But if I may, I'd like to do a little bit of advertisement for the Joint Map Societies. We will be having a talk on Saturday, January, 30th. It's going to be a 2-hour talk on gerrymandering, and it's going to focus on the more modern techniques. And one of the speakers, Jeannie Clellan from the University of Colorado in Boulder, is a mathematician, and she will be talking about some of the mathematic aspects of developing gerrymander. So I welcome you all to that meeting.
Can you put something into the chat maybe with a link to that?
I'll try.
Maybe someone can find that.
I'm doing it right now, Ron. I'm putting the link in.
Okay, thanks, John.
Going in.
Mark.
Oh, that was an excellent talk, Susan. It's always nice when you learn something new. And believe it or not, this is the first time I recognized, and first time anybody pointed out, that Elbridge Gerry's profile was in the cartoon map. So thank you very much.
Susan, I was wondering about the Supreme Court cases. There have been a number of them. Can you provide any context to why they've been unable to identify or rein in this practice?
I can provide a little, and I welcome others' thoughts because there's just a whirlwind of cases. And as I was finishing A History of American 100 Maps, I was trying to do this essay last because the courts were handing down things week by week in 2018, early 2018 and to 2019. The big case, of course, is Common Cause versus Rucho. That's R-U-C-H-O, which I believe in 2018, correct? Essentially said, the Supreme Court essentially said, this is not our responsibility. The federal courts do not have governance or jurisdiction over what look to be partisan and political problems. So essentially it kicked it back to the states. Now, some states have litigated this: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Maryland. And those, by the way, are both accusations against Democrats and Republicans. So this is being scrutinized in both parties, depending on which party dominates the state legislature. But there has been a flurry of cases about this, some of which say that these redistricting efforts at their worst violate the protection of free elections. So there has been, what they're using now, Tom, is referencing back to state constitutions. And most state constitutions have some kind of clause for free and fair elections. But you can bet that this will continue to be litigated.
Thank you.
If others want to weigh in, who know more about the litigation, I welcome that.
Other questions? Anything else in the, let's see, Edward Franco asks, has any other state followed the California method of redistricting to combat gerrymandering?
I assume Ed's referring to the commissions. Is that, I want to make sure.
That's correct.
Yes. Yes, I understand that that's kind of the gold standard now. I know that Colorado is looking at that. There's great interest within the state legislature of moving forward along those lines. And so I've heard it held up. But Ed, I don't actually know whether other states have adopted that.
I think Arizona has adopted it because I think the California initiative was somewhat modeled on Arizona.
I thought the gerrymander, that image is a great example of persuasive mapping. It has like real power, you know, and that always struck me. I mean, I always thought, you know, it explains a lot, you know, right there. And so, you know, of course, mapping is a rich visual tradition. It goes back thousands of years, but this image is clearly an example, you know, of the power of visual images.
Yeah, I'll put it back up just so folks can see real quick, because I agree, Heiko, that this is what gives it such enduring power, right? Is the way in which it's turned into, or anthropomorphized is not quite the right word, but I think you know what I'm getting at there. And I just have to express again my sympathy for poor Governor Jerry, because it's sort of a footnote, but the redistricting plan was repealed within a year. Because it came under such scrutiny, and partly because of these early newspaper maps. One thing I learned when looking at the wood blocks in Library of Congress was how difficult it was to create this map at all. It's 4 separate blocks. So the significant sort of time commitment here and expertise in terms of the history of map making is interesting as well.
Susan, I want to jump back to the present day. The recent results in 2020, this past month, in particularly in North Carolina and Georgia, let me isolate North Carolina for a second. I didn't really see what the results were there, but did they overcome the previous gerrymandering efforts by the vote, or did it actually succumb to the gerrymandering of earlier?
They were asked in 2019 to come up within a few weeks a new system. And so there's been back and forth. I believe that remains litigated. I believe the North Carolina legislature remains firmly in Republican control. And there's an enormous amount of money that's been poured into what's called the North Carolina District Trust, I believe is the name of the organization. That's essentially a political action committee to defend the lines that were drawn by the most recent legislature. But you're right, it is, Ken, this is something that is unfolding before our eyes. I will say, unrelated to this or tangentially related, I have never felt so humbled and so challenged in my profession as I have in the last year, particularly in the last 2 months. I have talked to a dozen reporters just this week about how to make sense about what's happening, both politically in the longer term and in the shorter term, in terms of what we've seen in the last 2 weeks. It's not easy.
Susan,
It took a lot of people by surprise.
Susan, to answer that question about how many states have independent commissions, Wikipedia has come to the rescue, of course. California, Arizona, Idaho, and Washington State.
Thank you, that's helpful to me.
Well, Susan, Mike, Ken, Susan Powell, Julie, Ron, Elian, thank you guys so much for your presentations. This really has been wonderful. Mike, any concluding
No, I just want to say thank you. If we can give a big round of applause to all the presenters. It's been a really informative and terrific presentation. Really appreciate everybody's contribution, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the presentations. I look forward to the next meeting. So, and if you have ideas, definitely shout out and let us know, and we'll be reaching out to you for ideas for future meetings.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Tom. Susan, good to see you guys.
Great innovation, Mike and Tom.
Thank you. We'll be posting the video on the CMS website. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks all.